Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the first installment of our Ashrae Ireland chapter COVID-19 technical mini-series. My name is Daniel Coakley and I'll be chairing today's session. Hopefully everyone can see the slides. So here's the agenda for today. So I'm just going to start with a short introduction and cover some housekeeping issues, and then I'll hand over to our panelist for today's webinar, Dr. Parag Rastogi, for the topic, a data-driven COVID-19 response framework for global workplaces. There will also be around 10 to 15 minutes for questions and answers from the audience, and I'll finish with some closing announcements. So just before we begin, I just wanted to raise a couple of points regarding questions and feedback during the seminar. So hopefully you should all have access to questions tab on GoToWebinar. So that will allow you to submit questions or feedback throughout the seminar, and we'll try to address those in the Q&A session later on. You should all also have access to a handouts panel somewhere on your GoToWebinar panel, which will give you access to the presentation material from today. So there's a lot of slides with links to further information, so you can access those through the handouts. And finally, there will be a follow-up survey after the webinar finishes, and we'd really appreciate if you could just take a couple of seconds to respond to a few short questions. One is just if you would like to receive further information on today's topic, just send us a yes or no response, and we can send you further information after the seminar. You'll be asked to provide a rating for today's speaker and any additional feedback or questions you might have. So firstly, just to give an introduction to where this series started. So I suppose the Ashrae Ireland chapter has up until now mainly focused on face-to-face technical events and training. So the COVID lockdown forced us to cancel a lot of our planned events and start rethinking our strategy for this year in order to best serve our members. So we started by forming a new subcommittee, which is focused on gathering and disseminating information and guidance for our members in Ireland. And most of that information is presented through our website, and the link is provided on the slides. We also are launching this series of technical webinars, which will address a variety of topics, tackling the spread of airborne infectious diseases. And finally, in parallel to this series of webinars, we're also planning to run a series of short technical articles from expert members of Ashrae and invited speakers, which we'll publish on our own website over the coming months. And you can also see the technical article related to today's talk, which was published in the May-June edition of Building Services News. So over the next couple of months, this is the first in an 8-part mini-series of webinars, which will run every 2 weeks between now and September. We're hoping to bring together a range of expert panelists covering topics related to reducing the spread of airborne infections in the built environment. The first 3 speakers are confirmed, including today's speaker, Parag. The topics over the next couple of months will include indoor air quality, building monitoring, facility management, ventilation, filtration, and air cleaning. And all of these webinars are free and open to anyone to attend. So as well as the Irish chapter activities, I just wanted to highlight some of the information that Ashrae headquarters have made available to the public in response to COVID-19. There's a lot of links on this slide, so I'd advise you to download the handouts and follow the links to get further information. So firstly, there's a dedicated web page, which I've linked here, that covers specific guidance related to HVAC systems, filtration, air cleaning, and building reopening, among others. Ashrae also started a new epidemic task force, which is formed up of over 100 expert members, who are all volunteers. You can view a roster of those members on the link provided. And there's also a facility for asking any questions you might have, technical questions related to Ashrae guidance, for example, through a dedicated email address. On a more detailed level, Ashrae have released and updated a number of position documents on infectious aerosols and airborne infectious diseases, which again I've linked on this slide. A really valuable resource, as well as the literature access that Ashrae has made available for free, including a lot of the relevant sections of Ashrae handbooks, standards, guidelines, technical journal articles, and presentations. Again, they're all made available on the link provided. And finally, there's the Ashrae Learning Institute, which offers free instructor-led training courses. And they're currently running a series of building reopening webinars for a European audience. So I've just listed a couple of those upcoming, recent and upcoming webinars on the next slide. And some of those are paid webinars, but many of them are free to attend. So I think we're ready to hand over to our speaker for today, Dr. Parag Rastogi. So Parag is lead building physicist at Arbnco, a building performance technology company based in Glasgow, Scotland. His work focuses on health and well-being in buildings, integrating climate risk analysis into building performance evaluation and planning, and the use of machine learning, data science in hardware and software in buildings. So I'm just going to hand over to Parag now.
Hello, thanks, Daniel. So I'll just start the presentation. Hopefully you can all see and hear me. Okay, I guess there's no way of confirming that you can actually see my presentation, but I'll assume that's working now. Okay, start with, I'm going to enable my webcam as well. Nope, that's a really big webcam, but there we go. Right. Okay, so we're going to speak today about, I'm going to speak today about a data-driven indoor air quality framework for post-COVID-19 re-entry. I'd just like to acknowledge my co-authors, so that's Niall, John, and Graham. This is our team at Arbnco in Glasgow that developed this framework. Everything I'm going to present here today is actually published. We have a long read and a short read, and if you just go to our website, arbnco.com, there's a link towards the COVID-19 page, and that'll give you all the information that I have here in sort of a more conference paper / journal paper format. So this is just a presentation based on that. We will be taking questions, and I think Daniel will be the one who will be triaging the questions. So I'll just go through this, and please note down your questions and put them in the chat, and I'll see them later. Okay. Let's start with the caveat, very important, because this is not medical advice. Please do not regard it as such. It is should not be used as a submission for a legal obligation. That's not the purpose of this. Please, oh, sorry, I was trying to move. Okay, there we go. This is not, the thing with this, a lot of what I'm presenting here is that the guidance on COVID is related to what we know now, right? It's based on what we know now. Some of the things that we don't know about COVID is how the exact mode of transmission and the exact infectability, the exact effect on the human body, and so on. That doesn't mean we shouldn't act on it. It just means that all the sources I have here have been cited as is. I assume they're in good faith that they're giving me the right information, and the guidance will change over time. That doesn't make it bad guidance. It in fact makes it better guidance, because when you have more evidence, you might need to change your guidance. So yes, please follow government guidelines, and this is just a supplement to that. So diving straight in, just a brief overview of the modes of transmission, because this is important to understand why I'm going to say what I'm about to say. Primarily, we're looking at the airborne route for infectious transmission. I'm not saying that's the most important one, but current research suggests that that's virtually certain that aerosol transmission is happening, which is why it's very important that social settings, are controlled for the transmission of this infection. There's droplets, and contaminated surface will transmit through contact or fomite transmission, and that's where you have measures such as cleaning are effective. And as the evidence progresses, we'll realize that, okay, one was more important than the other, so we had to slightly tweak our protocols. But the basic ideas behind everything I'm going to say today, and that's been contained in the guidance, for example, from Ashrae or CIBSE, is sound, right? So going over this, one that I'd like to focus on is airborne, and especially I'd like to focus on the fact that airborne transmission, what really matters is dilution of the pathogen, right? So the first step, of course, is to eliminate the pathogen by, people who are symptomatic should not come into the building, obviously. The second level is, well, there are people who are going to be in the building that are not symptomatic, are still shedding viruses. So you want to be able to dilute the pathogen, and that's where a lot of what I'm going to talk about will deal with. And keep in mind, of course, and maybe I don't need to belabor this point, is predicting exact airflow is very, very difficult. So I won't try to talk about a solution where I need you to do a CFD analysis, a detailed CFD analysis calibrated with sensors for every room of your building. That's just not realistic. I'm not going to give you a solution where it's about measuring the viral load of every square centimeter of air in the space, waiting 5 days to get the results back. What you need is something that works now, and it's good enough for what we need to do now. So I just took this image from a group called the Ember Strategies group. They're very, very useful stuff they've been putting out. And this is adapted from OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration in the US. It was originally developed for hazards, like industrial hazards. So, it talks about what are the most effective ones, going down all the way to least effective ones. And it's interesting that, as a layperson, you think of PPE, so that's your masks and stuff, being very effective. I mean, they are, but they're nowhere near as effective as elimination, substitution, and engineering and administrative controls. What I like about this slide is that it makes, this image, is that it lets people sort of figure out which levers they can actually control. What do you actually change? You can't be sitting over everybody's shoulder telling them to behave a certain way. But there are things you can do about access and density and airflows that you can actually change as a building manager or an engineer, and which is where you need to make your decisions. So, using this framework, I'm going to present a framework that focuses on the two aspects, which are engineering controls and administrative controls. So this particular presentation is about engineering controls, but in the paper, which which details all of this, we have discussed both engineering and administrative controls. Please go and read the paper. There's a short version and a long version, and they're both on our website. So the framework we're talking about consists of, the first step, of course, is impose the controls. This might be about changing ventilation rates, might be about changing signage, and so on. Well, measure and verify, and this is very important. And this is where we, we go one step further than the existing guidance, is to say, well, you have implemented a control. You need to be able to verify that it actually worked the way you thought it would work. And I can't stress enough the importance of design intent does not equal operational reality. So you really have to know, did it actually work how I thought it was going to work? Inform and engage occupants. This is something that people seem to ignore routinely. People who are actually on the shop floor or people who are actually in the office are going to know very well how the hazards are developing. Sometimes their instinct might fail, sometimes it might work, but they are an invaluable source of data for you. And then finally, review and improve. Nothing you won't get anything right the first time, so you have to try and review and improve things. Just to sort of put this in context, we have minimum controls of many buildings, as we all know, are just sort of run at the bare minimum, get by with what you can, and we're trying to get them to best practice. And now actually we're saying on some metrics, COVID good practice is beyond what we thought used to be best practice. And a good example of that is recirculation or heat exchange, right? When people talk about best practice, they talk about meeting, your Ashrae 62.1, 11 liters per second per person kind of, or whatever the minimum flow rates, minimum fresh air requirements from Ashrae. What people don't realize is that that's, the operative word that is minimum. That doesn't mean it's the optimum. So there is a big debate in Ashrae and in SIPC about, well, maybe you should be ventilating for health rather than for just, minimum odor control. I'm not going to comment on those specific guidelines, and those guidelines are still valid. What I'm going to say is you might have to think beyond what we accepted before as being minimum. In many cases, minimum is not good enough. And of course, the simplest way to think about this is you identify your gaps in what you have, and then you make a list of to-dos, you go through them, and then you improve and review and so on. And there are really good guidelines out there. SIPC has published some very detailed guides, so has Ashrae and Reva. Look them up. There's always scope to follow those. We'll keep the questions for later, so I'll move on. So just talk about specific engineering control. I'll give a few examples from our own experience. So the top engineering control that most societies are recommending now, or all societies are recommending now, is increasing outdoor air ventilation to dilute pathogens. Right? So the idea being, a person who's carrying the virus comes in, they shed viruses, and we have well-documented cases of people when they talk, when they sing, when they shout, when they're just breathing. Well, you shed viruses. And that's not to say that you're somehow culpable for it. You may have no symptoms, you may have no idea, you have not been tested. So you just come in and people are shedding viruses. That's something we have to accept, and we can't seek to control that 100%. So increasing window ventilation is another strategy, for example, where window ventilation is possible, kind of achieves the same outcome, right? Outdoor air ventilation, is one way of doing that is window ventilation, and no recirculation. And the reason this has come into the picture is because when you have, imagine you walk into, I'll give the example of let's give the example of a conference room. When you walk in and it's been occupied for a while, you can smell the people. Your nose is a good detector. It tells you that the air is not fresh. Now imagine that air is being recirculated to other rooms, and that's being recirculated through the mechanical system, and they pump back into the space. The things that you could smell, think of them as tracer gases. I'll give you an example in a second. And that is a good indication of the fact that if those gases can move with that air, then so can viruses, right? So what I like about, well, I can't say I like about my own framework. That's like sort of reviewing my own work. But what we tried to do with this framework is always relate an action to a measurable outcome, and then also an unintended consequence that may occur, right? So in this case, we're saying if you increase outdoor air ventilation, you should have lower carbon dioxide levels. Carbon dioxide itself, we all know, is not a pollutant. It's not toxic at exception. It is at exceptionally high levels, but to get to that, you would notice way before that something was wrong. But carbon dioxide is a very good indicator of the ventilation effectiveness. You can see the steady state calculations in the SIPC guides, in the Ashrae guides. That's one. That's a good base to start from. In our case, what we've been looking at is CO2 is a great proxy for crowding. It's a great proxy for lack of ventilation. So you don't need to know the exact number of people in a conference room. What you need to know is that the CO2 level is spiking. The ventilation is not able to keep up with the number of people that are there. Does that mean you should increase the ventilation? Potentially. Does that mean you should have fewer people in there? Probably, right? Because if lots of people are jammed into the space, they're probably close together and transmitting viruses to each other. And of course, you have to have unintended consequences, which is where the inform and engage part really becomes important. Because if people don't accept higher air speeds, they're going to shut your system off, and then they will increase the risk of transmission and so on. You have to get them to accept different comfort levels because you have changed the operation mode. So enough talking, let me get to an example. This is an office in Singapore that is operated in pretty classic fashion. I would say classic fashion for a hot and humid climate in Asia. They pre-cool in the morning and they keep the temperature I would say it's high by the standards of the UK and Ireland, but it's okay by people who are used to being in hotter climates. 27 degrees Celsius is not a bad thing. And so you come in the morning, they sort of overcool in the morning before people come in, and then they sort of just maintain that and they let it slide a little bit. But if you look at the CO2 part, it's a different picture. There are some very serious ramps of CO2 every morning, and the CO2 level is persistently high, right? So if you look at the Ashrae recommendations, the minimum outdoor air requirements, that corresponds roughly to a CO2 level of 1000 ppm. So they are barely meeting the minimum most of the time. So we're not even talking about COVID good practice yet. Right? We're just talking about the state of the art. The humidity is fine. It's on the higher end of what's recommended at the moment, and that's fine. And we just ignore lighting for now. That's not the bottom of this project. Just to give you an example of what that looks like. So sorry, just in this particular snapshot, I was looking at every sensor in that office. It's a fairly big floor, and the office is spread over the entire floor. In fact, there's a couple of sensors on another floor as well. So this is really an overall view, which is why you should see some variation. What's amazing is you don't see a lot of variation, which means obviously that they have very good control. And so there might be a few outliers, some rooms that are behaving quite differently, but by and large, the office is very well controlled. So when you look at an individual meeting room, again, they were very concerned about humidity and temperature. And our feedback was, it's fine. There's nothing wrong with the humidity and temperature. You're doing a very good job of controlling it. But look at the CO2. This kind of CO2 profile tells me that meeting room is either always crowded, or the ventilation system was not designed for the occupancies that are which are actually being practiced at this particular meeting room. So this for me is a red flag to say that, well, your ramp of CO2 is very steep. The CO2 level climbs very fast. Your ventilation system is not keeping up. You are not diluting the pathogens if there are pathogens in here, which is increasing, on the multi-parameter sort of calculation for the probability of infection. Lack of fresh air is an aspect, or fresh air is an aspect, and that aspect is actually suffering here. Let's look at an example from London. This is again pre-lockdown. So, I was looking at, sorry, this was also pre-lockdown. So this was February. I'm still talking about pre-lockdown just to show what normal occupancy looks like in an office. Slightly on the higher end of our recommended operational guidelines. Nothing particularly wrong with it. It's what the office wants to do. The humidity is on the lower end, but we know this is a persistent problem in northern Europe, where we're driven mostly by hydronic heating systems, and so you just heat the space and you don't rehumidify anything. So humidity definitely on the lower end of acceptable. For some reason, light levels are quite low, but that was a strange side. CO2 by and large is actually fine. The overall picture of the CO2 is fine. There is a little band of CO2 levels because the sensors are in fairly different locations. So we were trying to figure out how to actually make sure that they align. And it's not so important that all the sensors are within like 5 ppm of each other. If they're close enough and they follow the same trend, for example, when an office is unoccupied, then the sensor should slowly revert back to fresh air levels. Then that's good enough as a measurement. But if you look at one conference room, actually, then the picture is quite different. So this is roughly the same time period. This is like end of Jan, or Jan, Feb in this case. So even though the overall picture was fine, so if, for example, you had taken a spot check, you could have just by chance been in a place that was fine. There was nothing wrong with that place. And we actually had this issue with, well, not issue, but we had this discussion with another client who showed us a report of their spot check of detail of the VOCs, so volatile organic compounds, pollutants in their space, and they said that it's fine. And yes, the report looks fine indeed. There's nothing wrong with it. But when you actually look at the continuous monitoring results, you find that there are points in the day where it is fine, and there are points in the day where actually it is really quite bad, the VOC levels. Now, is that a serious problem? Well, I don't know until I go on site. I mean, I don't need to go on site, but the client goes on site and figures out where are those VOCs coming from? Are they from cleaning products? Are they from from furniture and so on? So the point of that aside was that individual spaces in an office might have actually radically different behavior from the rest of the office. So when we talk about verifying and measuring things, your policy, which is for the entire office, may actually not work out at all for a particular space in the office. And so, you just look at the ramps that you get and the peak load, as it were, of CO2 that you get in this particular conference room. And this actually, this graph was great for me as sort of a validation, because when I presented this to the client, this graph immediately caught their attention that, oh, we kind of anecdotally knew that our conference rooms were getting a bit crowded and sort of warm and stuffy, but this is just plain to see that every time that conference is used, pretty much it's overcrowded and it's really, really not keeping up. The ventilation's not keeping up. Just to give you an example of the kinds of things that we might, sorry about that. Just to give you an example of the fact that, when this room is not occupied, it does go back to fresh air levels. So it's not like I guess I'm trying to say I'm not making up that data. So if you look at that same conference room in April and May, when that office was shut down, then we know for a fact that, it should be at the background levels because nobody's in the space to produce CO2. Now, again, CO2 is produced by a person in the space. So if there's no people there, there's no CO2 to, in that space. Also, there's no viruses being produced there because there's nobody, again, to produce those viruses in that space. Another recommendation from both CIPC and Ashrae is about air treatment and filtration, particularly when you are forced to recirculate air. And they recommend basically really high performance filters and induct or upper room ultraviolet germicidal irradiation, that's UVGI. There are some measurable outcomes. I won't go into detail about this because you'll have Bill Banflett speaking about this in 4 weeks from now, and he's really the expert for UVGI. But this is something worth looking into especially for bigger HVAC systems. Just to give you an idea of the kind of, when I say, how you think about recirculation, while in an ideal world, I would never mix air between zones. That's not really realistic in most offices. I'll use this office as an example because they are actually a site office in central London. So it's still like 30 to 40, maybe about 50 people who work in that office regularly. And they have to work there for almost a year, right? So their health and well-being and their productivity is being affected by this office. And if you walked into their office, you would understand immediately that there's something wrong with the ventilation because there is absolutely no way they can avoid recirculation between spaces because that's the way it's constructed and the constraints of the site, because they're actually a construction office. They're supposed to get out of there when they're done with the construction. To give you an example of the kind of lack of fresh air that exists in that office and where perhaps air filtration could actually be beneficial, is look at their sort of pre-lockdown profiles of CO2. I'm looking at the overall picture again. And they're really, really high. And in this case, I know why that's happening. It's because there's terrible ventilation and a lot of mixing in that space. The PM level is not too high, but it tends to be, it's way higher than most offices should be because it's right next to the construction site. And there was no sort of curtain between the construction site and the office to prevent the dust coming in. What's interesting is that, most of April, there was virtually no activity. Nobody was in the office and then in the site office, and then they've started coming back to work little by little. This is a great example of an office where they can't not go into the office. Technically, they all work with computer, of course, in the office, but it's all site related work. So in this case, using CO2 as a metric, which indicates, which is related to the infectious probability, is a great idea because it tells you that there are people here, the ventilation system is being overloaded, there's recirculation happening, so you need to do something about it. Just to give, I think this is the office I was talking about earlier in London again. Speaking of recirculation, and in this case, let me use a sort of slightly left field example of VOCs as a tracer gas, because obviously I can't measure viruses, right? So going back to our first office that we discussed, which had the conference room doing, behaving completely differently from the overall. Let's look at that office again, and we see that the CO2 level background is fine. It's below. There are some small spikes. It's a lot of data bunched together, which is why you can't see individual lines. But there are some small spikes in the CO2, but by and large, almost all the sensors are at background levels because virtually nobody is going into the office. It's very sporadic occupancy. However, in May, there was a heat wave, right? So we have a sensor in that office in the reception area, and the reception area is fully glazed, right? What that means is that we had a lot of VOC production. This is not cleaning because there's nobody going in there. This is not food. This is purely temperature-related off-gassing. Now, why am I going on about VOC is because this is a perfect example of where something that's generated in the reception will now propagate throughout the space because they're all connected. So even though technically there's no mixing happening, recirculation, some amount of recirculation is inevitable. So this is a kind of a tracer gas, as it were, that we could use to verify whether things are moving from one zone to another. Moving on to local air treatment, I won't spend much time on this. That's not really sort of part of my expertise, but the current guidelines do tell you that you can use portable room cleaners with heavy caveats, and I would recommend looking at the CIPC guidance and the Ashrae guidance on when this is actually effective. For example, the CIPC guidance says more than 10 square meters is unlikely to be effective. Because think about it this way: you have this tiny, relatively tiny, small cleaning device, and it's trying to get the air through it. And if you just have a lot of airflow and a big space, how much effect is it actually going to have? So yeah, I said possibly ineffective for reducing viral load. And of course, source control and elimination. This is one aspect that a lot of people don't like to talk about, but I think it's worth talking about because it is quite important to remember that a big way of transmitting viruses of any sort, not just COVID, is actually the fecal oral route. So when you visit the toilet, you smell things and it's unpleasant. If you could, to quote my friend Dr. Jovan Pantelic, he says, if you could smell the viruses, you would realize how smelly a toilet actually is. So the smells are giving you a proxy for the lack of ventilation. So you really have to think as a building owner, building operator, an engineer, that toilet exhaust has become even more important than it used to be. It was always important. There are other viruses and bacteria that can be transmitted from toilet usage, and especially in public toilets. And I'm not talking about surfaces, I'm talking about the aerosols. But you have to really look at how your toilets are generating aerosols. There are different technologies of toilets, what the exhaust is doing. The exhaust is actually being extracted out and being thrown out into the outdoor air or not. And that's something that, again, there are some measurable outcomes. And in all of these, energy penalty is something that we have to be careful about. Although I would argue that it's not as bad as most people think in terms of energy outcomes. So again, looking at our favorite office in London. Well, I like this office because I happen to go there a lot, so I know it very well, and we have our sensors in that space. An example of when suddenly you could have spikes in, if you were to walk into an enclosed space, it's the reception area. I said it's connected to all the other spaces, but the moment you shut all the doors, it becomes a fairly enclosed space. So again, when the temperature was high, we had VOC spikes. And so these VOCs, if they were, let me just do a thought experiment and use them as a proxy for viruses. Now you walk into the space, instead of smelling the VOCs, you're gonna smell the viruses, and you would realize what an actual high load of viruses there is. Of course, in this case, nobody walked into the office because there was nobody was supposed to go into the office. So the CO2 level is actually very low. And of course, there's general IQ. There was some, towards the beginning, there was some talk especially in Asia about, well, shut down your air conditioning because air conditioning is spreading the virus. It's like, well, it's not the air conditioning itself. Of course, the recirculation and all that is an issue. And in fact, that's one space instance where a human sort of intuition goes wrong, because if you think that, lots of people think that colder air is fresh air, so fresh air and colder air is often confused with each other. So for example, in this case, we looked at an office in central Scotland, and we realized that, there are parts of the day when the temperature and humidity do drop quite significantly, and that's not great for immunity of the workforce. So it doesn't have so much. There is some new evidence that virus doesn't do so well at higher humidities and higher temperatures. So being on the top end of the acceptable humidity is probably a good idea in this case. So let me finish off with a few points. We need to start measuring outcomes, because if we don't have visibility, we don't have a direction of where we should need to go. Because this is not going to be a sort of straight shot. Install a meter, you have no viruses, good to go. An improper implementation can really sometimes increase exposure while generating sort of false confidence, which is the worst of both worlds. We've been doing some work on coverage with ARC, which is USGBC, and we can talk more about that later, how you can actually calculate, quantify the coverage of each sensor, so that you can have an idea of, well, what is the right number of sensors roughly that I should have in a space. But broadly speaking, you're trying to hit almost all the HVAC zones and areas of high interest, such as meeting rooms and toilets, right? Occupant engagement definitely needs an update, because we need to go from this paradigm of pick up the phone and call somebody, and maybe your complaint is answered or not. We probably need to have more signage, and this is in the requirements now, or guidance now, and move that towards active engagement and encouragement. It is your building, you are occupying it, your comfort is important to me, your safety is important to me. So we need to indicate to people and train people, and maybe there are smarter ways of doing this, of how policies are actually, asking them how policies are working, because they are your eyes and ears. As a building manager, or as a building engineer, you can't be everywhere all the time. And that's what, if you look at OSHA's guidelines, that's what they actually recommend as well. And don't forget that there are unmeasurable outcomes. There are user acceptance as an issue. You need to be aware of the fact that when people walk into a space, they need to accept that space. They need to feel comfortable. They need to feel like, they need reassurance. So, at the end of the day, even if a lot of this turns out to have been overkill, what's the worst outcome that can happen? Is you made a healthy building. That's not the worst outcome in the world, because it's not just the COVID that matters. There are other viruses, and we all know that there is now a lot of evidence that fresh air impacts, the lack of fresh air or pollutants in the air impact health. Airborne transmission is very likely, and so that necessitates building level action as well. And remember, risk cannot be zero. So I would not want to go out there and then sort of speak to my my building occupants and say that the risk is now zero. Do what you like inside. That's not going to happen. We're trying to manage risk here. So, just a final word is, not everything I've said applies to every single building. And I think that sometimes sort of gets lost, is that, you don't need to follow the entire checklist if it doesn't apply to your building. The best thing is develop a plan and follow to the highest reasonable level. And of course, at the end of the day, can't be stressed enough, review and improve. So I'll just end that with, there's some resources, and there's some nice videos you can watch about aerosols and shedding. But maybe move on to questions now, Daniel. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Parag. Yeah, so there's a couple of questions that come in. One was, well, just in relation to the access to today's webinar. So the slides, as I said, are made available, and they are available on our website, and the recording, I believe, will be available in the next within the next week. There was one technical question here, Parag. In Ireland, there are a lot of naturally ventilated buildings. Have you any examples in your work on improving ventilation effectiveness with naturally ventilated systems?
Yes, we do. Actually, the building in, I have to admit there are more mechanically ventilated buildings in our work than there are naturally ventilated buildings. However, if you look at the CIBC guidance, for example, there is a lot of guidance on naturally ventilated buildings. And the stuff that I said around measurement of ventilation effectiveness, while I couldn't show naturally ventilated examples here, actually the one in Scotland that I showed is partially naturally ventilated. There are some areas that can open their windows. But the core of what I said about measurement and dilution still applies. It's just that the mechanism by which air is introduced changes. I don't know if that makes sense as an answer. The best thing I can say right now is yes, I couldn't show an example of natural ventilation here. Actually, we do have a building in California that's naturally ventilated. Now I think about it, and it's the same problem. The only change we had to apply was that in that case we have to rely more on. We can't rely on controls to make up for lack of fresh air, because there's no lever for me to turn off and on the ventilation. I have to rely on occupants actually opening windows and making sure that they stay open, where the inform and engage part becomes even more important than it would be in a mechanically ventilated building. That's a big difference, I think.
Okay, thanks, Parag. There's another question just coming in. A standard installation often includes a number of ceiling cassette AC units, which may or may not have a fresh air supply. What is the guidance regarding operation? We don't want to recirculate contaminated air, but comfort of the occupants has to be provided as well.
Yeah, so that's a good point, because this is what I was saying, that this is where the occupant's own intuition will fail, because they will think it's fresh air, but actually it's just cooling from a cassette unit. It's interesting that most of the guidance I've been reading and I've been looking at talks about contamination in the sense of moving contaminated air from one zone to another zone. That's what you really want to avoid. So in an ideal world, every zone would be ventilated outside individually, so you don't want to recirculate through the HVAC system. Now, in a situation where a cassette unit is sort of cooling the same air over and over again, I don't think I would say that you need to shut down the cassette unit, because you still need, as you said, you still need to provide comfort. It just needs to be supplemented with a fresh air route. And that's where the challenge will lie for the individual engineers, identifying a route for injecting fresh air or extracting the stale air. The fact that it's literally the AC is distributing the air around, that's going to cause an issue. And that's where it's important to remember that before we talk about engineering controls, there's a whole bunch of administrative controls, which is to say, if you don't need to be in the building, don't be in the building. If you're showing symptoms, don't be in the building. But once a person actually enters the building and starts shedding viruses, and if they happen to be sitting right where the AC is, taking in air, then you're going to have an issue where the AC will actually make the infection transmission worse. There's a paper out of China where they looked at a restaurant, and they found, well, this conclusion is not hard and fast, but it was an interesting first step. And they found that there was a high incidence of infection in the path of the AC stream, because a lady who was shedding viruses was sitting close to where the AC sort of takes in the air. So it was sort of the AC was in fact propagating her viruses. So yeah, I'm sorry, that's a bit of a convoluted sort of sentence there. But the point is, yes, I know you can't shut down the AC, but it would be useful to think of a mechanism for introducing fresh air into that space.
Okay, thanks, Parag. There's a couple more questions just coming in. So are plans including also a return to improved normality phase, or when the virus risk will be almost eliminated and priority will fall again on mitigating climate change? Is there advice on even better strategies than what we have now? So.
Right. Okay. Yeah, I think I understand the question. So yeah, I mean, hopefully we all hope the virus, this is not an issue for the rest of for the rest of our lives here. But remember that there is always going to be some background level of disease transmission in buildings. Sick building syndrome is a thing that's existed since the 70s, roughly. Right? It's not, this virus has just highlighted and magnified the problem immensely. But the idea that buildings need to be healthy has existed before this. And you're right, we do need to go back to mitigation. Buildings contribute a heck of a lot of carbon emissions and energy usage. And yes, I do agree that the guidance will evolve as the virus, the stages progress. And I think a good example of this is your visit to the hospital. When you in the middle of a pandemic, when you walk through a hospital or a healthcare facility, it's almost like a friend of mine described it as imagine you wearing a bubble of like 2 meters and nobody will approach you through that bubble. Even your doctor sort of pokes you from a distance. And then as the pandemic goes away, we're back to our normal operating procedure, which is, well, the doctor still wears gloves, and your doctor still wear masks and so on. So some precautions don't go away. So I think it's important to remember that climate change mitigation and healthy buildings are not antagonistic. Sometimes it looks like you're consuming more energy, but if you're trying to save energy by affecting people's health, I think that's a false economy. So yes, we will change our guidance. Maybe we'll say you don't need to do deep cleaning to the same level now that you needed to do. But the idea of introducing fresh air, I think we need to go back to saying, well, okay, maybe install an MVHR unit, maybe have more efficient heat pumps and so on. But and I'm biased, of course, because I work on the healthy building side of things. I can't imagine a space where you prioritize energy efficiency to the point that people actually start getting sick in the building, whether it's a pandemic or not.
Okay, thanks, Parag. I don't know if we'll get to all of these questions, but if we don't answer them all, we'll follow up by email after the seminar. So there's another question here on what's your thinking on the use of HEPA filters compared to using simpler, cheaper combined pairs of panel or compact filters for recirculated air?
For recirculated air specifically, right?
Yes.
So if you look at there's an interesting graphic, and I'm sort of seeing it in my mind, a table, but I don't remember exactly who published it, of the effectiveness of each MERV rating. So HEPA MERV, fairly close. HEPA is sort of the really high performance one, and the effectiveness at removing particles of a certain size, right? Of course, this was mostly done to talk about, when you're bringing in outdoor air and how you should clean the particles and all that. The current guidance is that if you have low-level filters, so non-HEPA filters, from a viral aerosol sort of perspective, it's not really going to be effective. You really do need, if you're going to put in filters for aerosol, for capturing aerosols, you need to really get into HEPA filter and beyond. Sorry, that's a bit of an incomplete answer, but if you go to the resources, the best place to look is why does that moving? Yeah, the best place to look is actually the Ashrae position document in infectious aerosols and the CIPC guidance. They have really specific justification for why a HEPA filter works and the sort of lower MERV level filters don't work in this case. And the best answer I can give you is that the higher you go in the MERV system and HEPA filters, they filter out smaller and smaller particles. And in order to filter out aerosols, you need to get to a filter that actually filters out small particles, if that makes sense.
Okay, thanks, Parag. And there was a follow-up to your answer there saying, surely we should not be referring to MERV. There is an international ISO. So
yeah, sure. Yeah, my bad. Yeah.
So maybe a quick question was regarding the examples you showed. What ventilation systems were shown were installed in the office examples that you showed?
So do you mean like which brand? I don't know which brand it is.
I think what type of systems?
I can't remember off the top of my head. But what I do remember is in this case, yeah. Sorry, I'll have to look that up and get back to you. Not remember off the top of my head which one I was looking at. Yeah. What's interesting about the office in London, though, and this might be of interest to some people, is that this is a complicated case where the building is managed by somebody else, and this is one tenant in the building. So we are only able to measure what's happening in the tenant space. We're not actually able to measure what the landlord is providing as fresh air or as chilled water or whatever it is. And that's a complication where it's like, well, the tenant can do some things, but they can't do everything. But we can only measure in the tenant space. So in this case, we had to do some sort of mediation between the landlord and the tenant in terms of, well, okay, this is not really anybody's fault, but we need to change this operating procedure and blah, blah, blah. So I can look that up and get back to you. Yeah.
Okay. Another question, any comments on electrostatic filters?
No, I'll give you a second-hand comment from Bill Blanflett's presentation, and Bill is really the best person to talk about this. But as far as I know, the current guidance is they're not recommended. The details of why they're not recommended, please read the Ashrae guidance on that, and listen to Bill's seminar in a couple of weeks, 4 weeks from now.
Yeah, so Bill will be on one of these seminars. He's confirmed for the 16th of July at the same time.
Yeah.
Another question, how many air changes of fresh air or recirculated air that is free of viruses would you recommend for a room?
So yeah, I haven't really been working for a long time in air changes per hour because I'm really focused on outcome of what can actually be measured. And the reason I say this is because I'm trying to clarify. Okay, I'll make a sort of controversial statement and then I'll clarify why I said that, right? It doesn't quite matter how many air changes you think you have, what you're actually pushing into the space. What matters is that adequate to dilute the pathogen that's being generated there? So yes, of course, I'm biased in favor of sensors because I work with sensors and I think they solve all the problems in the world. But the point here that I'm trying to make is that if your CO2 starts climbing, it means your ventilation system is not keeping up, right? So for example, the Ashrae and SIPC guideline says, keep your ventilation on all the time. That's fine, especially when it's occupied, fresh air should be on all the time. But they also say, keep it on overnight as well. Well, yes, that's fine. But the point is, at some point, you will reach a situation where there's no more generation of people in the room, and you have actually exchanged your entire, air inside with fresh air. So your CO2 should be back down to fresh air levels, which we saw in the webinar, in some of the slides beforehand. So yes, you could continue putting more fresh air. Is it doing anything? I don't think so, because you've already diluted as much as you possibly could. So I don't remember the exact number, but it's like, if you think at the Ashrae guideline are actually less helpful in this case. The SIPC guideline is more helpful. If you look at for example, the ARC, the new ARC re-entry product from USGBC, what we've tried to do with them is try to get them moving from the bare minimum towards a higher level of performance. It's the IDA classification in the European norms, right? So you go from 4 to 3 to 2 to 1. And what you realize is that actually 11 liters per second per person, which was the original, sort of the number that's thrown around all the time, doesn't lead to the best outcome for fresh air levels. So instead of telling you something specific about how much air changes per hour there should be, I would say, they definitely have to be more than what you thought they used to be, in terms of the bare minimum acceptable from Ashrae 62. But exactly what point they should be depends on how densely that space is occupied, how often it's used, which is why I keep harping on about measuring CO2 or measuring humidity and getting people to tell you whether it's crowded or not crowded. Okay. Sorry, a bit of a roundabout answer, but that's, hope that conveys it.
Thanks, Parag. And just one last question because we're running out of time. I agree with your comment on the need to measure and verify. For some, it may not be possible to install systems to continuously monitor CO2, VOCs, etc. in every space. Is there any guidance on the use of spot measurements and how to use this effectively?
Yeah, so this is a very interesting question, and thank you to whoever asked that question. This sounds a bit intimidating, right? It's like, oh, now I suddenly have to put all these systems in place, and it's, there are worries about cost, there are worries about hardware management, there are worries about sensor, software management, worries about analytics. You get all this data. What am I supposed to do with it? I think it's important to remember that even start taking baby steps. Spot checks are not a bad idea, but there's a catch, right? So a spot check to me is great for things that are very hard to measure. Like a lot of pollutants are very hard to measure, and they just cannot be done with continuous monitoring. It's way too expensive. A spot check done by a person, carrying a CO2 reading, CO2 meter around, and so on. It's better than nothing, especially when you're trying to sort of let's say, quote unquote, calibrate your system. So, you said you went to a certain level of operation and you said, I need to verify whether this is actually happening in my room. Maybe my dampers are broken. Maybe something is happening, blah, blah, blah. So in some cases where the problem is persistent, for example, you have persistently under ventilated a space, and you can go measure at exactly the right time where it's in typical occupancy. In those cases, it might be useful to do a spot check, right? If you think about it mathematically, right? If the underlying signal is stable, then measuring at a point in time is a good representation of the signal. However, we know for a fact that the underlying signals from most buildings are not stable. So a point in time measurement could be completely misleading. One way around that, of course, is to do many point in time measurements. So you say, I do many spot checks. At what point the number of spot checks becomes more expensive and cumbersome than just installing a continuous monitoring system? I don't know what that exact crossover is. But there's also an argument to be made saying that, well, maybe for your critical areas, you install a continuous system. You don't have to do it for the entire building. Start with one, and then you supplement that with spot checks. And the more comfortable you get with the data, the more you can start using this. Yes, hope that helps.
Thanks very much, Parag, and thanks very much for your presentation and answering all of the questions today. For the ones that we didn't get to, we can follow up by email afterwards. So I just had a couple of quick closing announcements. So our next webinar will be held at the same time on Thursday, 2nd of July, and we'll be welcoming Mr. Michael Curran, who's current chair of CIBSE Ireland and head of building services at the National University of Ireland, Galway. Michael's presentation will focus on addressing the challenges of COVID-19 for building services, and in particular, the implementation of government protocols and advice from professional institutions like Ashrae and CIBSE. I also just wanted to highlight the Ashrae annual conference, which is being held as a virtual 4-day event for the first time in its history. And this will include over 300 speakers in 92 different technical sessions, starting on the 29th of June. You can register as a member for $99, and it gives you access to all of the webinars live, and also you have recorded access for 18 months after the event. And it's worth noting as well that the non-member price is $329. So if you're not a member, it might be worth signing up to avail of that discount for the virtual conference. And if you're a student, the price is even cheaper at $25 for access to the full event. If you're not already registered on our own mailing list, just make sure you go to the Ashrae Ireland website to register and subscribe to our mailing list. And also, if you're interested in volunteering for any of our committees, we have a few upcoming places on our committee and positions becoming vacant from July. So if any of you are interested, please get in touch. And lastly, just thanks to all of our sponsors and supporters who make our ongoing activities possible. And thanks everyone for joining today. We'll close the seminar now. Thank you.